since it looks like we have everyone here. And I know we're streaming on Facebook too. So hi, everyone. My name is Shekar Krishnan, and I'm running for City Council here in Jackson Heights in Elmhurst, District 25. And it's so good to see everyone here. Thank you so much for joining on an issue that's so important to our city right now, especially on a day like today, where the City Council voted appallingly to approve the Flushing rezoning. And so, it impacts us so much here as Queens communities in Elmhurst and Jackson Heights, and we'll be talking about that today. I'm a parent of two small children and also a community activist and civil rights lawyer representing low-income tenants who are being harassed and displaced by some of the worst slumlords in our city, and also representing community coalitions against rezonings by the city of New York that are discriminatory and violate fair housing laws. These are issues that are front and center today. And I'm running because it's come to a point in our city where we need to fight for change in a systemic way to really dismantle all of these systems of oppression, from housing justice, housing injustice, to policing, to our schools, to public health, that are all interlocking and all need to be undone and rebuilt so we have a city that works for everyone. We are truly facing an interlocking crisis of racial justice, public health, and affordability in our city. And front and center in this crisis are our communities of Elmhurst and Jackson Heights that were hit the hardest by COVID. And that was no accident. It was a result of decades of disinvestment in our neighborhoods. One of the issues that is front and center in our neighborhoods right now, and frankly around New York City, is housing justice. Housing is a human right, but it isn't treated that way by our city or by our state government or by our federal government. And right here in our communities of Elmhurst and Jackson Heights, we see that firsthand with a number of tenants who are displaced because of harassment by landlords, by rezonings that we have to fight against, whether it's Amazon, to Target, to Flushing. These are all really problematic patterns of development that actually have an impact right here in our neighborhoods, displacing so many long-term immigrant tenants and low-income tenants who they only know our communities here as home, but are forced out by these kinds of really problematic development practices. I want to go through for just quickly my platform and our platform around housing justice in this city. The first part of it is that we have to actually treat housing as a human right and to make sure that we're actually defending tenants in this city. The first thing we need to do is really invest in government, in housing that is actually affordable in the communities that it's in, which means, one, rehousing our homeless populations permanently instead of relying on a broken shelter system, instead of allowing landlords to illegally warehouse vacant apartments during a pandemic right now. If we are actually to make sure that our homeless actually have permanently affordable and permanent housing, then we have to make sure that we're utilizing all the housing that's available to us in a way to rehouse our homeless. That's number one. Number two is we need to be investing in our public housing. It is unacceptable that we see rezonings like Flushing and all those around our city, while Queensbridge Houses right here has one of the highest lead paint rates in this entire country. And it's because no level of government actually invests in public housing the way they should. Instead, they look to privatize public housing, and that never works. The same way it does not work for city government to rely on private developers to build so-called affordable housing that is never actually affordable for the communities that this housing sits in. Government needs to take a much larger role in that way, in investing in public housing, in low-income co-ops like HDFCs and our Mitchell-Lama housing, and also in community land trusts as well. Secondly, we have to put a moratorium on all of these luxury rezonings and developments in our city. They are all proceeding without any whatsoever ability to actually look at the way in which these rezonings segregate communities and don't actually further fair housing. Many of us have worked on the ground in the housing movement to fight against these rezonings because the way in which they actually violate the Fair Housing Act and don't study the neighborhood impact that these rezonings will have. We also need to make sure that our community land use process, otherwise known as ULURP, is completely redone to actually allow for community voices to drive the process instead of city government or instead of developer interests. And finally, we need to be really beefing up and expanding our legal services and other organizing programs in this city. The Right to Counsel program in New York must truly be a right to counsel, which means it must fund tenant organizing in our city in addition to legal services, and it has to cover far more tenants as well. We need to make sure that basement apartments, or the BASE campaign, led by a number of citywide community groups as well, that basement apartments are actually legalized and made into the safe, permanently affordable housing that they should be. This is a huge issue here in our Queens communities of Jackson Heights and Elmhurst, where so many immigrant families live in basement apartments with no protections whatsoever. These are the kinds of protections that we need to be investing in, on top of also enforcing the housing laws, making sure that city government is collecting on fines when there are violations in our building, and actually doing more to hold landlords and developers accountable. This is the kind of systemic change when it comes to housing that we need in our city, and that's what we're here to talk about today too. Now, we know firsthand that in Elmhurst, in particular, we have seen so much luxury development, all the way from Queens Boulevard, where all these high rises are going up, down to C.C. Moore Park, where there are other new luxury units going up too. And all they're doing is displacing tenants who have lived here for so long, making rents far more unaffordable, and actually destroying historic sites in Elmhurst, a neighborhood that is so historic in terms of what it means to our city, and the number of sites here, whether it's the Yanta House or the African American burial ground, that are being lost to developers and demolition by developers. We're going to talk about all of that today, but I want to take a pause first, welcome you all to, and welcome our incredible panelists who are here today, some of the leading tenant advocates in New York City, who I've personally worked with too, but I've worked with so many community groups and grassroots organizers throughout the city, and who I have so much admiration and respect for, and who are leading this fight right here in Queens, as well as around New York City. So I first ask you each to introduce yourself. Maybe we'll start with Rima.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Shekar, for having me. Some of you may have, seen me around doing a lot of tenant organizing work. I've worked in housing for 10 years and actually grew up in public housing. So I know firsthand what it feels like to live in a home where, the paint is chipping off, there's cold water. Being a part of an immigrant family where I had to translate at the young age of 12 to make sure that my family had adequate housing. And so I'm very, very excited to have this conversation with you all and start digging into, what's really needed for our great city, and how we can move forward in making sure that, we're taking steps to make housing a human right. And all of those things are possible. I know it seems like a radical, thought, but it's not. It's absolutely necessary and pivotal to anything we do in life in order for us to thrive, even mental health wise. We need to make sure that where we live is safe and clean. And so I'm so excited to join you guys today. I'm excited to continue this conversation.
Thank you so much, Rima. Seonae?
Thank you, Shekar, for inviting me to speak. And thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here. My name is Seonae. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a housing organizer, and I mainly organize lower income, multilingual, multi-generational, multicultural groups, tenants in Flushing. And I have been leading the Flushing rezoning fight, which has been, we are still fighting. It's not over yet. We're still fighting. I'm here at my personal capacity. I'm happy to share my experience with y'all.
Thank you so much. Welcome, Seonae. Lina?
Hi, everyone. I'm Lina Lee. As Rima also mentioned, I was born and raised in Elmhurst, and grew up in a neighborhood of mostly immigrant families, and have really vivid memories of what it means to live in Elmhurst, but also in a very burdened community. So with that memory, I have moved on and have now reconnected with Elmhurst as a tenant attorney. I have worked in Flushing, Queens and North Brooklyn, really the two most hot areas for the most recent gentrification and development. So thank you for having me, and it's such a personal and privileged really presence to be here and to be part of this panel.
Thanks so much, Lina. It's so good to have you too. Alex?
Thank you, Shaker, for inviting me with this panel and also on your campaign. So, my name is Alex Rodriguez. I work for Council Member Antonio Reynoso. I'm also a Queens resident. I've been in Queens since I moved to New York City, and happy to be here. But just wanted also to mention that uh, I'm also the one that runs or organized the North Brooklyn Housing Task Force. I will say that is the first and only citywide task force in the city of New York in order to fight gentrification and fight displacement harassment from all these landlords, specifically in North Brooklyn, where I would say that has been the epicenter of gentrification since the early 2000s.
Thanks so much, Alex. It's so good to have all of you here. And I think you're right. The first housing task force was started in North Brooklyn. And now we're hoping to bring the second one here to Elmhurst. We want to talk about that today. You can see all our platforms, including this proposal of ours for a task force in Elmhurst at our website, www.voteshaker.com. Everyone is here in their personal capacity today, and it's so good to have you all here. So I guess I'll start first with Rima and Seonae. Maybe Rima first, I'll move to Seonae. First, Rima, can you talk a little bit about, you've done so much organizing in our Queens community, Jackson Heights, Elmhurst, Jamaica, and you've seen so much on the ground. What is the state of tenant rights for real on the ground in Elmhurst? What are we seeing? What kind of patterns of harassment? In your experience, we'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, so on the ground, that's a great question. I mean, on the ground, there is so much anxiety and nervousness around people's ability to pay rent. So if folks remember back between March and July, you know, from the federal government, there was an extra $600 that was provided. And a lot of that was, you know, people were able to lean on that money to pay their rent. And now what we're seeing is that because the federal relief is not there and there isn't any other form of relief from the state or from the city, people are, you know, trying to live off of $100, $200 a week. And that is not nearly enough to even cover, I would say, the average rent in Queens. I think 1-bedroom apartments are now going for $1,600, $1,700. You know, if you're making $150 a week in unemployment benefits, I mean, that barely even covers your food. And so what I'm getting on a daily basis is just this question about, I can't pay rent. What do I do, right? Who can I go to? And unfortunately, at this moment, there isn't really a solution that's come from the state or from the city. And I want to note that this is not a particular issue to anyone in Elmhurst or anyone in Jamaica. This is literally millions and millions of people across this nation. And we have to understand the magnitude of that. And what we, you know, the pandemic, although it's going in waves, what we really need to look towards is the economic crisis that is about to unfold. I feel like we're literally, you know, walking on a tightrope right now, and some way or somehow, like, we are going to fall through the cracks. And we know that the people that fall through the cracks are the ones that were already vulnerable, you know, already, you know, struggling, already living paycheck to paycheck. And unfortunately, unless we have the state cancel rent and provide mortgage relief to small homeowners, we're going to see a huge economic crisis, much bigger than the one in 2008.
Absolutely. I think a great point that you make too is just the national level of this crisis. And the scariest part is, like you said, Rima, there's been no relief from government at any level to actually deal with it. So what we're seeing is every tenant who couldn't pay rent in March can't pay rent now, and they're spiraling further and further into debt as the housing courts are reopening again. So I think that's a great point you make about the national magnitude of this and what it means for housing in the city. Seonae, you also have done such incredible organizing work like Rima in a community like Flushing. I read recently, and I think it's so critical to know this, has seen the second most amount of luxury housing development in New York City in the last decade, next to Williamsburg. Can you talk a bit about what are you seeing when it comes to tenant harassment in neighborhoods like Flushing and surrounding parts like Elmhurst too? And well, I'll stop there and then I'll ask about the rezoning after, but maybe you can talk about what you're seeing on the ground.
Absolutely. I like to thank Rima laying down and using the word like anxiety, right? Those are the real emotions that people are feeling, and it's so important to highlight those feelings and let people know that you're not alone, because it's systemic issues, and we have to address it by fixing the systemic injustice. I think for your question, Shekar, and the statistics that you shared. So it was from the New York Times article. I can share it later on the chat. It goes, flushing quietly. They use the word quietly. Flushing quietly became one of the fastest growing for sale markets of the last decade, second only to the Williamsburg. And I was thinking a lot about this word quietly. Why did this person use quietly? And I just thought of a lot of working class immigrant populations and tenants in Flushing. I wanted to share some examples how these predatory developers are taking advantage of limited English proficiency immigrants in Flushing. So there were there is this landlord who's been taking market rate rents from rent stabilized tenants for 30 years. And most of the tenants who were living in that apartment buildings were Korean immigrants, and they were limited English proficiency people. When lawyers found out about this, they had the language barrier because most of the people were not speaking English. So, and I see this a pattern when I'm organizing Flushing. I often found buildings that has similar issues that I mentioned in the previous examples, right? These landlords are taking advantage of people, and sometimes people, especially the immigrants and limited English proficiency folks, they are being evicted without knowing that they're evicted, right? The landlord intentionally put extra hurdles that's not necessarily written in the laws, that they don't have to do it, and tenants don't have to go through that hurdles, but they put those extra hurdles to make the tenant's life harder, make it harder for them to renew their leases, and therefore instead of fighting back, sometimes people, it's easier for them to pack everything and leave, right? Sometimes that happens if you're low income immigrant folks and you're not able to find a lawyer or advocate, or organizers who speak the same language as you and explain your rights. Oftentimes it's so much harder to fight back than packing everything and leave. So those are the things that I have been seeing, and because of the gentrifications and there is a overdevelopment in going on in Flushing. A lot of the landlord uses the construction as their tool to evict people. There are many, in fact, articles came out about that, especially about Flushing. When that happens, if it's rent stabilized buildings, landlord would use MCIs, major capital improvements, to increase the rent, and a lot of times, because the landlord wants to bring people in, kick people out, that has been the practice until, and still, but especially until the rent reform happened in 2019. So they wouldn't fix any repair issues for the long-term tenants. So those are the things that I've been seeing, and I've been trying to organize people and create tenant associations in each building so they can bring their power to fight back.
Thank you, Seonae. I think that's absolutely right what both you and Rima are saying too, just the level of the ways in which landlords will use these different tools of harassment. Rima, you want to absolutely add? I was going to say, what have you seen
I
too?
didn't see that there was a hand raised. thing in
Oh.
on
Sorry, that
Zoom,
works
but
too.
yeah, I think Seonae brought up a really, really important point about language, right? And limited English proficiency. I think the beautiful thing about New York City is that we have the, you know, the most diverse city, I would say, in the world. I don't know any other city that's as diverse. And the other beautiful thing about that is that we have these enclaves, right? Where we have Korean community members living in one place, Bangladeshi community members living in one place. And that also, you know, protects us and helps us, but is also a con in some ways, right? Because we are then separated from the systems and the institutions. And so when we fall into a position where we're served a notice from a, you know, a landlord, people almost automatically get nervous, freaked out. There are two things that my mom would always say to me, which is that we don't call cops and we don't go to the court. And I think that, I mean, speaks so much volumes to a lot of the reasons why some of these communities are very hard to reach. And you know, language justice is so important in us trying to reach these folks that live in these enclaves, right? Because it's not that folks are not intelligent, they don't sense these forms of harassment. They do, they probably just don't know the name, that it's construction harassment, but they know what's happening, right? And so I think it's so important, you know, to the work that Seonae, myself, and so many other organizers are doing, where they're centering language justice and being able to mobilize people, regardless, because we need to start, you know, we need to start bringing our folks into the from the community into these conversations of understanding that these systems and institutions are hurting them, right? And that any individual can really push to change a law, but they don't realize that they have that much power within them, that they can actually do that they can take ownership over, you know, a law that is just, you know, gentrifying their community even faster. And so I think language justice is just so key to us, you know, really pushing for housing justice in the city.
That's an excellent point. And I think it kind of goes to what you're saying, like these, you know, services and resources of government, if they're not accessible by language, then they're not actually reaching the populations that need the most help. And I think it's one of the biggest problems we see. You know, it's so, you know, it's so true when you say, I think we all know it on this panel too, our parents, you know, growing up too, we're so afraid to challenge the legal system in any way or take on the system in any way, because it may affect their place in this country. It may affect their future in some way, that they're so afraid to do so. And I think there's so many, you're right, so many tenants in our city who struggle with this choice every day and are just freaked out about going to housing court and freaked out about even taking the train even to get, let's say, services that are not in their community, because they don't know how to access them or what it'll mean to. So I think that's a really important point.
And Google Translate does not count.
Google Translate never counts. Lina and I were actually debating that once too, about the merit of Google Translate, and it never counts, right, Lina? Lina, I want to ask you, I guess, like a two-part question is, one, you know, as someone who grew up in Elmhurst, you mentioned it before too, born at Elmhurst Hospital, can you talk a little bit about how you've seen the neighborhood of Elmhurst change from when you grew up to being a lawyer now in our neighborhoods too? What are you seeing? And then I guess the second part is to Rima's point and Seonae's point too, about we have all these great laws that we've passed at the state level last year, city laws, but how come we're not actually seeing that working on the ground? Why aren't those laws that are on the books working on the ground? Maybe you can try to talk about both of those things.
Sure. So yeah, I grew up a block away from Elmhurst Hospital on 79th Street. And I remember, you know, even as a small child, the living conditions of, you know, my home, but also the families around me. And, you know, sadly, looking back, you know, and actually seeing my home, not much has changed in terms of conditions. And the only thing that has changed is my perspective on Elmhurst and the tenants living there. And that is that no tenant should be living under those conditions. And I think, you know, as an immigrant family, as you mentioned, you don't know your rights and you don't know how to enforce it. And as an attorney now, I can tell you that it's not the lawyers that enforce the law. It's actually, like Rima mentioned, it is the tenants and it's the organizers that actually enforce what is written on paper. The lawyers, what they do is they read what's on paper and they file the paper in court and they bring the case to court. But the real power and the real work is done by the tenants who have to live under these conditions every single day. It is the organizers who reach out to them, who bring and really create a unity and strength in the tenants, who then come into court and enforce these laws. Like you mentioned, New York City has the most expansive and tenant-friendly laws on its face. It has a very broad definition of what harassment means and what it should encompass. It has huge and very, on its face, outstanding penalties for each violation that the court should be enforcing. But as you practice more as a housing attorney, you see that the courts are the last ones to actually make any movement. And it is actually the work that is done outside the court that the judges then follow. So, two examples of that, and one is more urgent and relevant to us, is the eviction moratorium. It's laws that are passed to help tenants, go through COVID, and it stops actual evictions, as in it stops marshals from coming to your door and putting a sign up that you have to move out in 5 days. But what it doesn't do, it doesn't keep the tenants in their home. It doesn't give them any actual relief. What it does, it just delays the eviction process for these tenants who really have no other source of income coming in right now. And especially after even COVID will end, they will be left in a much more detrimental situation than pre-COVID. And I think, people think that because if you come in and you pass this law that says that now you can use loss of income as a defense during COVID, that somehow, that will save the tenants. But it's actually a much more uphill battle from here to put those words on paper, because, what does that really mean? It leaves out families who, single moms, for example, who did not lose their job because of COVID, but who had to stay home because their kids are now home. That wouldn't fit under the defense under law currently. And especially for undocumented tenants who, don't have any paper trail for the work that they have been doing. And a lot of employers who are scared to provide anything because, a lot of them haven't been paid in cash and there is no proof to show that they had lost this income. And especially for undocumented families, there is no relief from any source. So, it's really, and I think this is a really serious and urgent problem that people don't see coming because it was, paused. But, in January, when the courts really do open and these, laws, these new laws, is something that we have to now fight for, the courts are going to be the last place that it's actually going to effectively help tenants. Another huge example, and this is an ongoing problem before COVID, is, what is harassment? Because, that's a question that is so easy to answer outside the court. We see tenants go through, just living in just horrendous conditions. We see landlords banging on their doors every single day, asking for rent or asking to enter their apartment without their permission, offering illegal buyouts, doing construction at night, not cleaning up any dust so that children get asthma. We have seen all of this, in Flushing, Queens, in North Brooklyn, in Bushwick. And in court, on paper, it says that harassment encompasses all of these acts, all of these illegal acts by the landlord. But when it comes to actually fighting a case, it seems that the courts don't actually agree with that. And it's very rare to see even the arms of the city agency like HPD and DOB that is responsible for enforcing these laws on their own. They are the ones who forgive the landlords for these penalties. The judges rarely even, issue any penalty for harassment. It's actually very rare for a judge to find harassment to begin with. to issue the proper violations, and then for HPD even correctly calculate and collect these penalties to really punish these landlords that have, really nothing to lose to go to housing court. So, the real work is really done by the organizers out there and really the tenants. And I think we should be very wary of when we say that, housing is a human right, because that sort of implies that it's where, it's the courts that will really make the change. But at this point, I think the courts really are the last resort. It's necessary component, but it's going to require a lot more accountability on the city part, a lot of more work from the organizers on the ground, and really the tenants, to come out and voice their concerns.
Thanks so much, Lina. I think that court is part of the problem. Housing court is part of the problem. And I think we see that and we know that. And I think your point about centering and making sure in this work, tenant organizers and tenants are centered, and that's where the real power is everything. Because the lawyers aren't the ones doing it, the laws aren't doing it either. And to your point about, how much change there's been in Elmhurst, as we talked about before, so much development now happening and so many tenants living in buildings with tons of violations. I get calls also from tenants in Elmhurst being harassed by their supers, harassed by their landlords, talking about enforcement, talking about holding agencies accountable. I think a lot of times people think about city government as just passing laws and legislation and not realizing how much power and how critical it is that the enforcement is part of this too. Enforcement is frankly everything. Alex, I wanted to ask you, hearing the perspectives of Seonae, Rima, and Lina about what's going on the ground, you were responsible for starting the first task force in New York City to combat tenant harassment, and involving agencies and community groups who are on the ground doing the work. Thinking about if we were to start something like that here in Elmhurst, which so desperately needs it, can you talk a bit about what that task force looks like, and how can it be, I think we all need to think about how can it be used to help further the work of tenants and tenant organizers on the ground. But maybe you can give some perspective on how it's worked up till now and what are the different groups and stakeholders who have been involved in it in North Brooklyn.
Yeah, so absolutely. So the first thing that I would like to mention is that organizations and advocates are the most important thing. That's the, like off the bat, that like having this terrific women organization that they're like the people that are on the trenches is the most important thing, to be like having organizing, like the organizers, the tenants. That's step one. Second, yes, you should hold accountable your elected officials. So the way we started, and being very honest with you, is that it was something that never was heard before. So they were a little bit reluctant into like joining, but in my opinion, and I think that in everybody's opinion that is working with us for the last, I would say, 6 years, it should be the standard. And it's not. It's a shame that it's not the standard of like having the agencies having a sit down with the organizers and the advocates and the organizations talking one-on-one. So on many cases, the agencies don't communicate with the organizations. So that's our role as an office of elected official. But also the mission is like to build that relationship, and they need to answer and they need to be held accountable as enforcement. Sometimes the enforcement is not there, and even if the laws are written, we need to enforce, we need to hold accountable those agencies in order for them to go out, and the advocates, the tenants, they're everything in order to make that happen. What was the other part of the question?
That was it. Just what are the agencies who have been involved in it, and how has that worked out so far?
So yeah, the usual suspects are HPD, DOB, DSCR, but we also have added the Commission on Human Rights. Most of these landlords are driven by prejudices, and they also try to intimidate many of the, in this case, immigrants or undocumented immigrants that live there. We have included FDNY and and also the DA's office, the district attorney's office. So it's an open table for organizations to discuss the buildings and the issues with the agencies face to face. And that's something that had never happened before. And many of these organizations, they don't have that contact from the agencies to talk about specific issues. Through this, we connect the organizations to talk to the organizations and also the agencies. On many cases, the agency doesn't communicate between each other. So they need to have like the administrative code like ready to be discussing, and they also fight between each other about like what is DOB, what is HPD role, or like DSCR. So having them all on the table is super easy to get things done, and also to look about the cracks that the city has with the law in order to try to draft legislation that at the end can benefit the tenants.
Thanks a lot, Alex. Seonae and Rima, before we turn it over to questions, I just ask both of you, and then we'll turn it over to audience questions. I know there are a bunch, but I wanted to hear both of your thoughts as organizers. Given what you all see in buildings and building lobbies, there's so many violations. You try to call 311, inspectors come, maybe they don't come, they don't record violations. Do you see a value in having a task force like this where you've got agencies at the table that we can hold accountable and presenting to them buildings you're working on where we need inspections, where there are tons of violations? Do you see a value in that? Maybe I'll say we'll have Seonae first and then Rima.
Sorry, Shekar, would you mind repeating the last part?
Sure. It was just to say, do you see a value in having a task force like this where we can actually have the agency at the table to pressure them and hold them accountable when we call 311 and they don't record violations, or HPD inspectors come late or don't come at all? Do you see a value in a neighborhood in having these kinds of, in a task force we can actually present to them buildings and also hold them accountable when they fail, as they typically do?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the enforcement is one of the huge flaws in the system, where sometimes the people, tenants tell me that they try to do this. They called 311 and they tried to get the issues done, but they were not able to. They just came by and did nothing, or something like that. Or sometimes I heard things like, this was, I think he was living in public housing, like senior housing. I don't remember exactly, but it was one of the regulated buildings, and the landlord was turning off the heat, right, intentionally to harass this tenant and kick him out. But whenever the 311 folks are coming, landlord immediately put the heats up, right? So they were doing really, really
Exactly.
shitty things, but it was impossible for him, the tenants, to prove his point that this is all the show and the landlord has been harassing, right? Because like, how are you gonna prove? You can also write it down, but sometimes it's not enough. So absolutely, more we should really, really make sure our the enforcement is working.
Absolutely. Rima, what do you think? Oh, you're on mute.
I knew I was gonna do that at least once today.
No, don't worry.
I was saying I have some strong feelings about this. We don't have a city council person right now that's even ever offered that. They know that, many of us work in organizations where we are connected to tenants, and I mean, I think when you brought it up to me, I was like, wow, we can do that, and I'm still learning about these possibilities of how we can push and hold more people accountable. And I think to Seonae's point, there's a massive loophole in the 311 process, and like creating this kind of hurdle, and you have to pass this hurdle in order to, even if somebody has the courage to take somebody to court, it's like you have to hop all these these hurdles in order to get there. And so that in itself disenfranchises us, taking our liberty to due process, really. And I mean, I've heard so many people, and at first I thought like, this is crazy, this is ludicrous, of like, tenants thinking that landlords, and then we're talking about corporate landlords, right? We're talking about people with huge portfolios. We're talking about the A&E Realty. We're talking about Zara Realty. We're talking about really large, corporations that have money, and tenants thinking that, oh, but I think the landlord like pays off the inspector, and like, it's just insane. When you first think about like, oh, bribery in America, you think like, no, that can't happen, but in reality, can it? Yeah, it can, and so like, and it sucks that tenants have to go to that thought to think that, oh, I'm not getting justice because somebody might be bribed or something like that. And I think it's it's the most ludicrous thing, but it could be so true, and I don't think that tenants are necessarily asking HPD, DOB, DHCR to even like to favor tenants. It's not even about like favor me, favor my situation. It's literally asking them to be neutral, to the point of justice, right? In that you are not pro landlord or pro tenant, just remain neutral, right? Do your job and make sure that if there are violations, it's being captured, or if tenants point out that there's a false filing in Department of Buildings, and then they file something different with Department of Housing, the State Department of Housing, that you actually acknowledge that that's fraud, right? And so when tenants even get the courage to dig up that information and to really fight these systems, and then they turn around and the departments aren't talking to each other or pointing fingers, it just doesn't help organizers who are trying to build power. Ultimately we figure out a different way. We as people of resistance, right? We figure out a way to survive. We figure out unique ways to organize, to build power, which we are continuing to do. But I would absolutely love to see a task force of that nature in every city council district. It is absolutely necessary. And anybody who's a city employee gets paid by our taxes. So I want folks to understand that this is, we are tax paying folks. And so that means that the city needs to service us and to its true ability, which, wasn't much before, but I can tell you now that the tenant movement is growing. It is massive, and we are not going to hold back.
Thank you, Rima, for saying that too. And those are excellent points. And I think, one thing I'm going to say is we're going to get to a couple of questions I see here too, and I'm going to answer one as we're going, but everyone can turn on their video cameras at this point too. I know that we're getting to the question and answer portion. So if you want to turn on your camera and be on video, you can either put your question in the chat or, raise your hand and ask it yourself. And again, all these issues and ideas were presented also. You can check out our website, www.voteshaker.com. One thing I wanted to mention is one of the questions in the chat too is, to Rima's point, the way we can envision this task force. Mark had said, what does a task force look like? How can residents access it? Just as people are getting ready to ask their questions, I would just say, another question from Andrew is, what can regular tenants like us do? I think, Rima and Sunny are the best position to talk about what tenants can do, but the task force itself, I would say the way we can envision it is a collection of agencies like all the ones that Alex mentioned too, from DOB, Department of Buildings, HPD, Housing Preservation and Development, Homes and Community Renewal, the Human Rights Commission, Department of Health, because there are many public health implications of housing violations. Have the agencies at the table, have the groups on the ground, the grassroots groups who are doing the work, that many of the incredible organizers here are part of today, are at the table too, as well as tenant leaders, to the extent there's public housing leaders as well, tenant association leaders too, to go through all of the buildings where there are issues, where there are violations, and directly ask the agencies demanding roof to cellar inspections where inspections need to be done. Seonae talked about how, HPD oftentimes won't find a violation because a landlord will come and turn on the heat when the inspector is there and they'll mark no violation. We know that happens all the time. Now there's a chance to actually hold the agency accountable for that and demand of the agencies who are there reports and scheduled inspections to actually see what's going on, as well as status updates on violations, or to enforce permits that have been granted in buildings where there's immense tenants harassment, to question DOB as to why that's happening. But it's a much more expedited way to hold the agencies accountable rather than calling 311, where our complaints languish forever and we don't even know if the inspectors will come, and when they do, they don't find violations. This is a method of actually getting the buildings in front of them, your own building, buildings we're organizing, representing, and making sure agencies have to respond to it. So one of the questions that's come up, I'm trying to get through some of them too, from Daniel Shin is, are there any ways to change the laws that are written to make them more effective at protecting tenants in practice? How do we make the laws more effective? And I know that another question was, what can tenants do? What can regular tenants like us do? So maybe what we'll do first is, Lina, if you want to talk quickly about how can we make the laws, to change the laws to make them more effective in terms of protecting tenants in practice. And then maybe, Rima, you want to talk about what can regular tenants like us do? So Lina, maybe you want to talk about the laws first?
Sure. So I think that, the laws are written so that, these tenants' rights should be protected on its face. And last summer, there was a huge expansion of tenants' rights laws that were passed to more protect, especially rent stabilized tenants, to keep them in their homes. And now we're at the point where we're not even close enough to even enforcing what we had before those expansions. And it is a constant struggle in courts explaining these laws to judges and to HPD and to DOB, and just asking, like Rima said, to just enforce them on its own. And we're not asking for, we have the laws in place right now, but it's not being enforced the way that it should be. And, it really takes the effort of every person involved in this task force to actually enforce and protect tenants. It is the tenants, it is the organizers, it is every city agency, it is the electeds. And, they're all responsible for this. And, the court should be the place where, you're looking to, but it, sadly will be sort of the last in line, and they will follow what the community pushes for. So it really does lie with the tenants who come into court, and it's not the person sitting on the bench that's actually going to enforce these laws.
Thank you, Lina. I think that's an excellent point. Rima, do you want to comment? One of the questions is, what can tenants do?
Yeah, tenants can definitely do a lot now. I guess the question is, like, do you as a tenant individually want to do something, or do you as a building or your community or a block want to do something? And I think that will determine your path, right? So if you, like most of us, we live in buildings in New York City, right? So that means you're building. One really important thing to do is, one, you got to get out of the apartment. And I guess it's a little difficult during COVID times, but you got to meet your neighbors, right? You got to find out, like, what are the patterns happening in the building? I'm facing X, Y, and Z. Is there anyone else in the building facing those issues? And the chances are probably, right? If you're not getting hot water, probably everybody else in the building is not getting hot water. So one, it's like connecting with your neighbors to see collectively what you all want to do. You can absolutely connect with any community-based organization, and you can do it on your own as well. A lot of the rights that Lina is talking about is, available at DHCR's website, the Department of Home Community Renewal. I always get it wrong. They have fact sheets there. If you want to find out if you are rent stabilized, you can go to Just Fix NYC, which is a tool that organizers helped create in order to better organize and, figure out how many different buildings a landlord had, but many of them tried to hide behind LLCs. And you first need to find out, like, what kind of tenant are you? Are you a rent stabilized tenant? Are you an NYCHA tenant? Are you a market rate tenant? All of these factors determine the type of rights that you have. And then from there, you can figure out what are the laws, but also understanding what are the loopholes, because that's where the advocacy and the organizing work comes in. Every law, I say, has a loophole in it, and we can always work to get it better and better and better. And that's what we do with organizing with tenants. Even though we passed some massive bills last year, I mean, we have not stopped. We are now fighting for cancel rent. We are still fighting for the elimination of MCIs that Seonae talked about. And if you, I mean, want help starting a tenant association, that's usually the next step that we do. You can reach out to I'm sure any of our organizations for some tips and tricks on how to start a tenant association. And ultimately, as organizers, what we want is for you to have a tenant association that's self-sufficient without an organization, that you know that you and your buildings and your neighbors have power and that you can organize on your own. And that's ultimately our goal as organizers. Obviously, some buildings, start tenant associations and, launch very fast and go, far, and some take a little longer, and that's okay. So I'm happy to connect with folks. I can, drop my personal email down and we can chat and talk about how to start a tenant association.
Thanks so much, Rima. It's a very important point. And there's, I think, a couple other questions too that I'm going there's a few more, we have time for a few more questions. So one, we'll take three more. One is for Seonae. I wanted to ask, there was a question about, from Dan about so if stopping rezonings or stopping luxury rezonings and development, you just went through the Flushing fight and it's such an incredible, and it's not over yet, but it's such an incredible job, absolutely not, leading this fight from start to finish, making it a citywide issue, and making sure that we were all fighting around it together to oppose this rezoning. One of my questions is, or one of the questions from the audience is, if we stop this kind of luxury rezonings and development, what will it do since most developers can still build as of right? So if we are putting pressure on rezonings to stop them, how can we use that as a tool of leverage to stop developers from building as of right? I know that came up in the Flushing rezoning debate, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that too.
Oh my God, I hate that as of right argument because it's a lie. It's a myth. Whenever I talk to experts who has been, studying urban planning and things like that, and some of them were professors, and they always tell me that as of right argument is the lie. The first thing you would learn, or not, if not the first thing something you would learn during I don't know, urban planning 101 is that the developers wants to do rezoning because it's more profitable. It's absolutely more profitable. They will get a lot of tax benefits. It's like a giveaway. They just put the word affordable housing into their proposals and they just rip our neighborhood apart. They just take our neighborhoods away from the working class people. And that's rezoning. And that's why we have to stop this rezoning. And that's why this is the citywide issue. Working class, people of color's neighborhood are more targeted, right? And that's the Mayor de Blasio's plan. I don't know if I can say that.
Of course, absolutely. It's a terrible plan.
You can say whatever you want.
You can say whatever you want, absolutely. And I agree with it.
Yeah, great. I don't know. Yeah, just because it's not my event. I wanted to be careful. Yeah.
It is. You could go for it.
Yeah. So to talk a little bit more about it, and like Shekar mentioned, this, I talked to a lot of the leaders in different neighborhoods that are going through rezoning, and we found very similar patterns throughout, that working class, lower income immigrants are mostly really targeted and vulnerable, and we need to stop this racist rezoning first. That's the first. Second, we really have to stop this giveaways to the developer. Third, about the virtual hearing, it's so after it just makes me really angry about this. So we've been, a lot of people and tenants, we have been demanding, canceling the rent, and there are a lot of stuff that city agencies hasn't done to protect our families. But the one thing that's going fast and the one thing that's going, well doing is the rezoning, EULA process. They started the virtual EULA process after the COVID-19. So it's been violating our First Amendment rights to participate at the hearing and voice our concerns. When our tenants, so Flushing, for instance, 41% of Flushing families do not have internet access, according to Comptroller's Office. It's their city reports. But they're having this Zoom call over, on online platform. And, some of you know that on Zoom, you have options to call in, right? But when our tenants are calling in to testify at the hearing, they are saying, because of the volume of the calls that we're receiving, we're not allowing you to participate at the hearing. Absurd. It's happening in our city, right? And I wanted to make some connections to, I think it's very, very, very clear to the audience here. But ever since Mayor de Blasio announced that he wants to rezone Flushing back in 2014, dozens of rent stabilized buildings were bought by the predatory landlord, like
Zara.
yeah, name it, like Treetop, name it Pinnacle, A&E. Dozens of the rent stabilized buildings were bought by them, and what that means is that a lot of small business owners had, their rent was increasing. They had to close down their small businesses. So a lot of people who worked at those small businesses, they lost their jobs. In Flushing during COVID, at some point, it became food insecurity issue. It became huge issue because people were not able to find not only jobs, food, right? So at the local food pantry, there are lines of 10,000 people waiting to get food, because those food shops were closed prior to the COVID because of gentrification, right? There are a lot of other issues that working class neighborhoods has to bear, and we are the one who has to bear the negative consequences of all this rezoning, not the developers, right? Developers can go to Whole Food or Target and pay $5 for the food, milk or whatever, right? But a lot of working class folks are not, they don't have that options available. So I just wanted to make that connections back to our discussions.
Absolutely. That's a great point, Seonae, and I agree with you too, that there's ways to also, just as someone who's fought against many of these rezonings against the city, there are ways to use the leverage of rezonings to also put pressure on so-called as of right development, and to make sure that it's not actually done as of right, but that we're actually pressuring developers even in that context too. I know that I want to be mindful of time, so I'm just going to say 2 questions. One, I'll try to quickly answer, and then Alex, I want to turn it over to you. Both Tiffany and Rachel and Jennifer, I'll try to combine their questions, was essentially asking about, Rachel was asking about what can we do, or what I do in the council to help expand tenant harassment laws. Tiffany was asking about, is there a way this council could hold the mayor's candidates or the mayor accountable when it comes to enforcing the laws with the agencies? And Jennifer's, I think the greatest question is, can a task force actually work given all the problems that are going on and how comprehensive the problems of tenant harassment are in Elmhurst? So I would say Jennifer's question, I think would end there with Alex, but I'll try to give my perspective. To Rachel's point, one, there's so much we can do to actually expand both the definition of harassment and what constitutes it, and also make sure the fines are a lot higher too. The fines are throwaways right now. Like for landlords, harassing tenants is just a cost of doing business because they're so paltry. They don't mean anything. And for a developer in gentrifying neighborhoods, they'll harass tenants, pay the fine, and keep moving forward. So we have to actually make the cost so much higher. It's a deterrent really from engaging in those practices. It also means really expanding the definition of harassment to encompass every kind of practice. Coalitions like Stand for Tenant Safety have done so much to do that, but there's far more we can do to capture every kind of practice of harassment and attach penalties on the other side. We need to be making sure the city is actually collecting fines on the hundreds of violations in buildings that they don't do anything about. If they actually did that, they can take that funding and put it back into more tenant anti-harassment work as well. But right now, there are millions and millions, hundreds of millions of uncollected fines in the city that HPD doesn't touch at all, and DOB doesn't either. So, and I think to Tiffany's point, absolutely in the council, it's not just passing laws, but holding accountable the agencies, holding accountable the mayoral candidates and the mayor on actually enforcing the law too. This is so much about enforcement on every level of government, and the mayor is absolutely needs to be held accountable too on that front, and so do the candidates, frankly. The last piece, and we can end there with Alex, is just on Jennifer's point about can a task force work? A task force isn't going to solve the problem, in my opinion. It's not, but it's one more way of accountability that right now we don't have. And because of that, agencies feel that they can walk away and do whatever they want. And I think a task force is one more pressure point. And the organizers especially can talk about this. It's one more pressure point to put on these agencies to make sure they're actually following the rules and regulations set up. But ultimately, the success of our housing laws depends, as Lina said too, and as Rima and Seonae said, on our tenants and our organizing and together doing this work to protect our homes. Alex, I'll give you the last word just on that point of can a task force actually work?
Absolutely. So yes, I just wanted to be clear. My role, I'm a tool for you, like the advocates and the organizations. I work for elected official, and the same way that the mayor or the agency should be held accountable, the elected official should be held accountable as well. The way all these laws were passed in 2019 is because organizing, putting pressure on the elected officials, and that's how those laws were passed. I think that the task force works. I think that should be a standard in the 51 district, like citywide, because at the end of the day, you organize from the bottom up, you organize and you be holding accountable different people. So you hold accountable elected officials, and my role is to hold accountable the agencies. So I oversight the agencies as well, and I make sure that the agencies are enforcing or going the extra mile to do their job, not only a violation. A violation sometimes is a slap on their hand. So these predatory landlords and slumlords, they have money that they can pay those fines. So if the elected doesn't hold accountable the agencies, you hold accountable the elected.
Exactly.
So I think that it will be a great thing for the city and as a model. Before we started this, the council members started this, that was completely new. So the agencies didn't like that oversight from us and also from the organization, because we work for the tenants. The tenants are the people that elect the elected officials. So it's all about transparency, and we work for you. So I think that the first step is organizing, and then be holding accountable the elected to be held accountable, so they can hold accountable the agencies as well. So I think that basically my point.
Absolutely. I think that's a very great note to end on too. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Dan Brill, everyone who's part of this audience tonight too. And most importantly, I know Rima had to jump off. Thank you, Rima. Thank you, Seonae. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Lina. It is so nice to have all done. We really appreciate you all so much being a part of this and the work you all do every day too. So thanks, everyone. Check out www.voteshaker.com. Thank you, Millie. And it's good to see all of you. And we'll keep fighting this good fight for making sure housing is an enforceable right in the city. So thank you all so much. Thank you to our panelists too. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye.